The morning sun barely touched the tarmac when the private jet arrived at the terminal. Its polished exterior gleamed under the soft golden light, and the hum of activity around it gave off the usual air of importance. Passengers began to trickle toward the plane, carrying their bags, chatting quietly, and occasionally glancing up at the sleek aircraft with admiration. There was something about a private jet that made even seasoned travelers pause for a moment and appreciate the difference. Among the passengers was a woman, whose presence seemed quiet but immediately noticeable. She moved with a calm confidence, wearing a simple yet elegant outfit that suggested professionalism without the need for flashy labels. Her posture was straight, her steps measured, and her eyes carried a focus that hinted she was someone used to having control in her life. She didn't rush, didn't fidget, and didn't care about the subtle glances from other travelers. To most, she was just another passenger. To those paying attention, though, there was something different about her. As she approached the jet, a young flight attendant stepped forward. The attendant was eager to make a good impression, but had a touch of arrogance in their step. They greeted some passengers with a polished smile, their words a little too rehearsed. When they reached the woman, however, there was a slight pause. They gave a quick glance, then stepped back slightly as if trying to measure her worth. There was an unspoken judgment in their posture, a quiet assessment that the woman noticed but chose to ignore. The woman handed over her boarding documents with a polite smile. The attendant's fingers brushed over the papers briefly, their eyes scanning quickly, and then they nodded. "Welcome aboard," the attendant said, their voice courteous but tinged with a subtle, unspoken assumption, as if they believed they were dealing with a regular traveler rather than someone extraordinary. Inside, the cabin was pristine. The seats were wide, the surfaces immaculate, and the air smelled faintly of fresh leather and a subtle floral note from the air purifier. The passengers settled in, adjusting their seats and organizing their personal items. Some opened laptops, others reclined and closed their eyes, and a few walked up and down the aisle, stretching their legs before the flight. The woman found her seat, placed her bag in the overhead compartment, and then settled herself with her work materials. She opened her laptop quietly, her fingers moving deftly across the keyboard as she began reviewing documents, sending a few urgent emails and checking her schedule. She carried an aura of calm productivity, a rhythm that contrasted with the low hum of chatter and movement around her. The flight attendants began their usual preparations. Drinks were arranged in neat rows, snack trays were lined up, and safety procedures were rehearsed in hushed tones. The lead flight attendant moved through the cabin with a sense of authority, checking on passengers and occasionally giving instructions to the junior staff. Their eyes landed on the woman for a moment, and there was a flicker of judgment, a silent question of why she was traveling alone, why she wasn't paying more attention to the staff, and why she seemed so composed. The woman noticed, of course, but she didn't respond. She simply continued her work, typing quietly and reviewing her notes. Minutes passed, and the jet began taxiing toward the runway. The engines roared softly as the plane gained speed, lifting off smoothly into the morning sky. Outside the windows, the city shrank, and the clouds became a soft white blanket beneath the aircraft. The hum inside the cabin was a mixture of quiet conversations, the occasional clinking of a glass, and the soft tapping of keyboards. The woman leaned back slightly, taking a deep breath. Flying had become routine for her over the years, yet she still found a strange sense of serenity in the controlled rhythm of takeoff. As the flight leveled, the lead flight attendant returned to the cabin. Their steps were deliberate, and their expression carried the faintest hint of irritation. They approached the woman's seat, glancing at her screen and then at her calm demeanor. "Excuse me," the attendant said, their tone formal but slightly clipped. "Can I help you with anything?" The woman looked up, her eyes meeting theirs. There was no fear, no irritation, only a quiet assessment. "No, thank you," she replied politely. "I'm fine." Her voice was calm even, but there was a subtle strength in it, a sense that she was used to handling people who tried to assert authority over her. The attendant hesitated for a moment, then nodded, seemingly unsatisfied but unwilling to push further. They moved on, serving drinks to other passengers, occasionally glancing back at the woman as if to check whether she was following protocol or behaving as expected. The woman ignored the glances, focused instead on her work. She made notes, checked figures, and organized her upcoming meetings. Her mind was a machine of precision, each thought carefully placed, each decision weighed. Around her, other passengers began to notice the quiet energy she brought into the cabin. There was nothing loud or flashy, nothing meant to draw attention, yet her presence commanded it. People whispered softly among themselves, commenting on her calm focus and the way she seemed unbothered by the small inconveniences of travel. Some wondered about her background, her work, her life. Little did they know that her status and influence went far beyond what any observer could imagine. The flight attendants continued their routines, checking on passengers, offering refreshments, and preparing for the longer stretch of travel ahead. The lead attendant seemed increasingly frustrated by the woman's composure. She did not respond to their small jabs, did not flinch at the subtle dismissive remarks, and did not appear impressed by their authority. Each slight misstep they made, each assumption about her status or behavior, went unnoticed by her, or rather it was noticed, catalogued, and filed away for later. The atmosphere in the cabin was a mix of calm and tension. Most passengers remained oblivious, absorbed in their devices or conversations. Yet for those paying closer attention, the dynamic was becoming clearer. A quiet battle of perception, authority, and respect. The woman carried herself with dignity, unshaken by the subtle hostility, while the attendant struggled to reconcile their assumptions with the reality of her demeanor. Hours passed as the plane cruised above the clouds. The woman occasionally looked out the window, letting her mind wander briefly to her personal thoughts. Yet she always returned to her work with the same precise focus. She reviewed emails, made strategic decisions, and organized her calendar. Each action was deliberate, purposeful, and reflective of the life she led, a life built on determination, intelligence, and the ability to navigate challenges with calm authority. By mid-flight, the lead attendant had grown noticeably tense. Small mistakes in service had begun to accumulate, and their frustration was becoming harder to mask. Other staff members noticed but remained professional, careful not to intervene. The woman, sensing the growing tension, continued her work, aware that the situation might escalate but confident in her ability to handle it. She did not seek confrontation. She simply maintained her composure, understanding that time and patience often revealed the truth more effectively than immediate reactions. Throughout the cabin, passengers continued to observe her quietly. Some admired her calm. Others wondered why she seemed untouched by the subtle power plays happening around her. She remained entirely herself, focused, dignified, and quietly commanding. No one could anticipate the incident that was about to occur. No one could see how quickly the balance of power could shift once her true identity became known. The flight continued smoothly, the hum of the engines a constant background, the occasional clink of glasses punctuating the quiet. The woman leaned back slightly, reflecting on the work she had accomplished during the journey so far. Each email, each note, each decision had brought her closer to the next stage of her plans. She remained unaware of the intense scrutiny she was under, yet she was entirely aware of her own strength and position. As the first part of the journey drew on, there was a sense of calm before the storm. The cabin maintained its polished, professional atmosphere, but the tension beneath the surface was palpable. The woman's presence had subtly shifted the dynamics of the plane, introducing a quiet authority that the flight attendants had yet to comprehend. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the ordinary morning flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The sun outside continued its steady climb, casting a warm glow across the cabin. The woman typed one last note, sent a few final emails, and closed her laptop, placing it carefully beside her. She looked around the cabin, noting the small details, the expressions of the staff, the subtle glances of fellow passengers, and the overall rhythm of the plane. Everything was in motion, yet she remained the still center, aware, prepared, and patient. And so the journey continued, a quiet tension weaving its way through the luxurious cabin. No one could yet predict the incident that would change the dynamic entirely. The moment when assumptions would be shattered, and respect would be demanded not through anger or force, but through the undeniable presence and power of a woman who was not just a passenger, but the very owner of the plane on which they all traveled. The cabin hummed with the soft drone of the engines, a steady rhythm that usually brought comfort to passengers. Most of them had settled into a quiet routine, some chatting softly, others reading, and a few simply staring out of the windows at the endless clouds below. The woman remained calm in her seat, Her laptop closed now, documents neatly stacked beside her. She leaned back, her hands folded gently, observing the rhythm of the cabin, aware of the subtle undercurrents that flowed around her. The lead flight attendant moved through the aisle again, checking on passengers. Their movements were brisk, efficient, but there was a hint of impatience in their stride. They paused at the woman's seat, a slight frown on their face as if something about her presence continued to challenge their sense of authority. "Ma'am, would you like anything to drink?" they asked, their tone polite but carrying a faint edge of condescension, almost as if they were testing her patience. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting theirs. "No, thank you," she replied, calm and even. Her tone was soft but carried a subtle firmness, a quiet strength that discouraged further unnecessary insistence. She wasn't rude, but her composure was unmistakable, a reminder that she was fully aware of the dynamics unfolding around her. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. They glanced around the cabin briefly, then forced a polite smile. "Very well," they said, moving on, though their steps were noticeably shorter, more hurried, as if trying to regain control over a situation that was quietly slipping from their grasp. Minutes later, a small incident occurred. One of the other passengers accidentally dropped a cup onto the floor, and a soft clatter echoed through the cabin. The woman instinctively glanced toward the sound, not out of curiosity but from a natural attentiveness. The lead attendant, however, interpreted her movement as a challenge, as if she were somehow criticizing their handling of the situation. "What's your problem?" the attendant snapped suddenly, louder than necessary. Heads turned. Some passengers looked startled, unsure whether to intervene. The woman's expression remained calm. She did not flinch, did not raise her voice. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone steady, inviting clarification rather than confrontation. The attendant's face flushed slightly. "I said, why are you looking at me like that? I'm just doing my job." Their words carried frustration, a tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for much of the flight. Other attendants shifted uncomfortably, exchanging brief, uneasy glances. The cabin's quiet rhythm now carried a sharper edge, a growing awareness among passengers that something unusual was unfolding. The woman tilted her head slightly, her voice even and calm. "I'm simply observing as any passenger would. There is no issue." Her words were precise, almost measured, as though she were diffusing a situation with care, but the flight attendant, overwhelmed by the subtle challenge to their authority, lost their restraint. In a sudden, shocking moment, the attendant raised their hand and lightly struck the woman's arm. It was not forceful, but it was deliberate, a small act of aggression meant to assert control. Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers. Eyes widened, whispers began to circulate, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The hum of engines could not mask the sudden tension. The woman's eyes widened slightly, not in fear but in careful assessment. She did not recoil or shout. Instead, she sat upright, her gaze steady as though cataloging every detail, every expression, every movement. Around her, the cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Passengers exchanged looks, unsure of what to do, sensing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Did you just?" one passenger murmured quietly, though their voice was swallowed by the ambient noise of the plane. The flight attendant's face turned red, caught between anger and embarrassment. They had assumed compliance, had expected a meek response, and were now confronted with the unexpected. A composed, powerful woman who did not react in the way they anticipated. The woman's voice cut through the tense air, calm but unmistakably firm. "That was unnecessary," she said, her tone carrying authority without aggression. "I am a paying passenger, and I expect to be treated with respect." Each word was deliberate, measured, and carried a weight that made the flight attendant falter. For a moment, the cabin seemed suspended in time, the quiet hum of the engines juxtaposed against the sharp tension in the air. Other passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Some whispered to each other, while others stared quietly, unsure whether to intervene or remain passive observers. The incident had broken the usual order, introducing a human drama into the polished, controlled environment of the private jet. The woman, however, remained steady. She did not demand apologies, did not yell, did not attempt to escalate. She simply maintained her presence, a calm force in the midst of a storm. The lead flight attendant hesitated. Their initial instinct to assert authority had been met with unexpected composure. They had misjudged her entirely, assuming that aggression would elicit submission. Now they were faced with someone who radiated quiet confidence, who did not respond to fear or intimidation, and who seemed fully capable of addressing the situation on her own terms. I didn't mean," the attendant began, stumbling over their words. The woman held up a hand, not to silence them but to signal that she would not allow excuses to replace accountability. "Please," she said softly, "let us continue this flight professionally. We will address this properly once we have landed." There was no threat in her words, only an unwavering clarity that demanded recognition. The other attendants moved discreetly around the cabin, offering drinks and assistance to other passengers, carefully avoiding further escalation. Yet it was clear that the dynamics had shifted. The flight attendant who had struck her now realized that this passenger was unlike any they had encountered before. There was intelligence, poise, and an unspoken authority in her presence that could not be ignored. As the plane continued its journey, the woman allowed herself a brief moment to exhale quietly. She reflected on what had just occurred, understanding that such behavior from staff often stemmed from assumptions, biases, or insecurities. She did not hold anger in her heart, but she cataloged everything. The expressions, the tone, the gestures. Everything would be addressed appropriately, she knew, but not in haste or through rash action. The cabin settled again into a tentative quiet. Passengers returned to their activities, though the undercurrent of tension remained. Whispers occasionally broke through, discreet comments about the incident, speculations about what might happen next. The woman ignored them, focusing instead on her own thoughts, her own work, and the larger purpose of her journey. She knew that patience and composure were often more powerful than immediate confrontation, yet the incident had left a mark. The flight attendant moved through the cabin with a cautious stiffness, aware now that their assumptions had been incorrect. They checked on passengers more carefully, maintained a polite distance from the woman, and occasionally exchanged nervous glances with the junior staff. The balance of authority had subtly shifted, though the full extent of the change was yet to be revealed. Other passengers continued to observe quietly, some with admiration, others with curiosity. They noticed the woman's calm demeanor, her refusal to react impulsively, and the way she handled a situation that could have easily escalated. It was a lesson in restraint and power, a subtle demonstration that respect could not be demanded through aggression, only earned through composure and intelligence. The woman leaned back, her hands resting on her lap. She allowed herself to think ahead, considering the steps she would take once the flight landed. She did not need to act immediately. The incident had provided enough information about the staff, their behavior, and their attitudes. Every detail had been noted, every action cataloged. She knew that justice and accountability would follow in due course. The flight continued, the engines a constant hum beneath the tense calm. The cabin, once a scene of casual luxury, now carried an invisible tension, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that assumptions could lead to mistakes, and that the quiet presence of one individual could challenge the established order. Time passed, and the woman allowed herself a small smile, not out of triumph but from a quiet understanding of the situation. She was unshaken, undeterred, and fully aware of her own strength. The lead flight attendant remained professional, though visibly uncomfortable, while other passengers remained intrigued by the unfolding drama. The clouds outside shifted, casting moving shadows across the cabin, as if reflecting the subtle but significant change that had occurred within. The woman sat calmly, her mind focused, her presence commanding. The incident had been handled with grace, but the resolution and consequences would come later. For now, patience, observation, and quiet strength remained her tools, and so the flight continued, the tension beneath the calm atmosphere, a silent reminder that assumptions could be costly, and that respect, patience, and composure were often the most powerful responses to unexpected challenges. The stage was set for the revelations and actions that would follow, but in this moment the woman remained the quiet center of authority, unshaken, dignified, and fully in control of herself and the situation around her. The plane continued to glide smoothly above the clouds, the soft hum of engines blending with the occasional murmur of passengers. Yet beneath the calm exterior, the cabin's atmosphere had shifted. What had been routine just hours earlier now carried a quiet tension. Passengers whispered softly among themselves, curiosity and speculation lingering in the air. The incident with the lead flight attendant had left everyone alert, watching, unsure of what might come next. The woman remained seated, composed and calm, though her mind was alert. She had observed everything: the impatience in the attendant's tone, the nervous glances exchanged with junior staff, the subtle whispers among passengers. She had catalogued every detail, not out of vindictiveness, but because she knew how to assess people and situations accurately. She did not need to act immediately. The right time would come, and when it did, it would be precise, measured, and effective. Meanwhile, the lead attendant struggled to regain composure. They moved through the cabin with visible tension, aware that their previous behavior had been unprofessional. Every glance from the woman seemed to carry weight. Every small movement a reminder that authority could not be forced. The attendant attempted to serve drinks and check on passengers with renewed politeness, but there was an unmistakable awkwardness in their gestures, a stiffness born of embarrassment and the sudden realization that they had misjudged the situation entirely. It was during this uneasy period that the truth began to surface, though not immediately to the passengers. A brief hushed conversation took place in the cockpit, where the captain spoke quietly with one of the senior crew members. Papers were checked, digital files accessed, and an identification confirmation quietly verified. It was standard procedure for private jets when there was an unexpected incident with a passenger. But the outcome of this verification would soon be far from ordinary. The lead attendant returned to the woman's seat, their steps hesitant now. They carried a clipboard with notes, their face pale, their previous arrogance replaced by nervous uncertainty. "Ma'am," they began, their voice quieter, less certain than before. I need to apologize. I was mistaken and The woman looked up, her expression calm and neutral. She allowed them to speak but did not interrupt. Her eyes were steady, a quiet assertion of presence that subtly reminded the attendant that she was fully in control of her own reactions. The lead attendant's words faltered as the moment of truth approached. They could sense that whatever they were about to reveal would shift the entire dynamic on the plane. A junior attendant, sensing the tension, whispered to the lead quietly, their tone a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Are you sure you want to do this now? We should wait until after the flight." The lead attendant took a deep breath, trying to steady themselves. The decision had already been made. There was no turning back. "We need to," they said softly. "They need to know. Now." The woman watched this exchange quietly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Her calm demeanor never faltered, yet there was a subtle readiness in her posture, a quiet expectation. She understood that the truth, when revealed, would have a profound effect. She did not need to act. She simply needed to allow the moment to unfold. A small group of attendants gathered discreetly in the aisle, whispering among themselves. Some faces were pale with anticipation. Others carried expressions of guilt or anxiety. The tension in the cabin was palpable, even if most passengers were only vaguely aware of it. Something was about to change, though none could yet predict the magnitude of that change. Finally, the lead attendant took a step forward, holding out the identification documents with trembling hands. Their voice, now quieter and filled with an uneasy respect, carried across the immediate area. "Ma'am, we were unaware of who you truly are. We made a mistake and The woman's gaze met theirs. She remained seated, composed, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She did not need to raise her voice. Her presence alone demanded attention. "Please," she said softly, "let us speak clearly. What is it that you have discovered?" The attendant swallowed nervously, glancing at the papers, then back at her face. You are the owner of this plane. You are the person responsible for the entire operation." We did not realize." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that shifted the balance of the cabin entirely. Gasps rippled quietly among the nearby passengers who had begun to overhear. Whispers intensified, curiosity turning into fascination. Faces turned toward the woman. The calm, composed passenger who had silently commanded attention, now revealed as far more than anyone could have imagined. The woman's expression remained neutral, though her eyes reflected a quiet acknowledgement. She did not smile, did not gloat. She simply allowed the information to settle, understanding fully that this revelation would change how the crew interacted with her, how passengers viewed her, and how the remainder of the flight would unfold. The lead attendant stepped back slightly, their body tense, their face pale. I don't know what to say, they admitted. We were wrong. We should not have. You are correct, the woman said softly, her tone calm but firm. What occurred was unprofessional and unacceptable. I am not here to punish anyone out of anger. However, I expect accountability for actions that break the standards of service and respect required on this flight. Her words were clear, precise and measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The cabin now carried an air of quiet awe. Passengers whispered among themselves, astonished by the transformation of perception. The woman, who had appeared as just another passenger moments ago, was now recognized as someone whose influence extended far beyond the confines of the jet. She was someone whose authority was undeniable, whose presence commanded respect naturally, and whose calm composure in the face of provocation was extraordinary. The lead attendant's hands shook slightly as they adjusted the clipboard, clearly struggling to maintain composure. I understand. We will make this right. There will be consequences, and I
am truly sorry for what occurred. The woman nodded slightly.
Good. I expect a clear explanation of the situation once we land and appropriate measures to ensure such incidents do not occur in the future. I am fair, but I do not tolerate negligence or disrespect. Her voice was gentle, yet each word carried an unspoken power. It was the voice of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions, someone whose calm authority could guide even the most tense situations toward resolution. Other passengers continued to observe quietly, some with admiration, others with astonishment. They had witnessed the moment when assumptions were shattered, when appearances proved deceptive, and when patience and calm strength had revealed a truth that could not be ignored. The cabin was no longer just a space for travel. It had become a stage for a subtle yet profound lesson in respect, authority, and human dignity. The junior attendants shifted nervously, exchanging glances. They had learned quickly that the woman was not to be underestimated. Her calm demeanor, her keen observation, and her measured responses had already communicated more authority than any raised voice or gesture of anger ever could. They realized, perhaps for the first time, the importance of approaching their roles with humility and professionalism, rather than arrogance or assumption. The lead attendant took a deep breath, trying to steady themselves. I will personally ensure that everything is corrected, that protocols are followed, and that passengers are treated appropriately, they said. I will report this, and I will take responsibility for my actions. The woman inclined her head slightly. That is all I ask, she replied calmly. Accountability is not about punishment, but about ensuring that respect, dignity, and professionalism guide every action. This incident should be a lesson not just for you, but for everyone on this flight. The cabin gradually began to settle, the tension easing. As the words sank in, passengers returned to their activities, though whispers and curious glances continued. The flight attendants moved with renewed care, aware that the presence of someone so capable, so observant, and so composed demanded their full attention and professionalism. The woman leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Thinking about the journey so far, she understood that mistakes were often made out of ignorance or assumption, and that patience and clarity were often more effective than confrontation. She had handled the situation calmly, without anger, without drama, and without unnecessary escalation. Yet she had also established the unmistakable fact that respect and accountability were non-negotiable. Outside the windows, the clouds continued to shift, casting soft shadows across the cabin. The plane glided smoothly, the steady hum of the engines a reminder that, despite the turbulence of human interactions, life moved forward. Inside the cabin, a new rhythm had emerged, one of careful observation, quiet respect, and subtle acknowledgement of the woman's authority. And so the flight continued, the revelation of her identity marking a turning point in the dynamics of the cabin. The lead flight attendant and their colleagues had learned an important lesson. Passengers had witnessed a remarkable display of composure and authority, and the woman remained the quiet, steady center of control. The stage was set for the next part of the journey, where accountability would be addressed fully, and the true power of patience, observation, and dignity would be revealed. The plane continued its steady course, slicing through clouds that reflected the soft colors of the late afternoon sun. Inside the cabin, there was a palpable shift in energy. What had been tension mixed with curiosity was now a subtle awareness that something important was about to happen. The woman sat in her seat composed as ever, but her mind was fully engaged, planning the next steps with quiet precision. She knew that addressing the situation calmly but firmly was the key to ensuring accountability and respect. The lead flight attendant approached her seat once again, followed by a few other crew members. Their faces were careful masks of professionalism, but the underlying tension was impossible to hide. Each attendant knew that the woman was not merely a passenger. She was the owner of the plane, someone whose decisions could impact their careers and reputations instantly. The weight of that realization had settled heavily on them, and they were aware that this meeting could not be treated lightly. "Ma'am," the lead attendant began, their voice low and formal, "we are ready to hear your instructions. We understand that we made a mistake, and we are prepared to do whatever is necessary to correct it." The woman closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. She did not rush, for she knew that patience amplified authority. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and commanding, yet without a hint of malice. "Thank you for your acknowledgement," she said. "What occurred earlier was unacceptable. However, my purpose here is not to humiliate anyone, but to ensure that professionalism, respect, and accountability are upheld at all times. This is an opportunity for learning, not punishment alone." The attendants exchanged glances, a mixture of relief and apprehension passing among them. They had feared an angry reaction, but instead they were confronted with calm authority, an authority rooted in experience, intelligence, and clarity. The woman's presence alone demanded attention. Her demeanor communicated strength without aggression, and her words carried an undeniable weight. "I would like to understand exactly what happened," she continued, her tone measured, not from excuses but from a clear account of actions. "Honesty is required, and any attempt to minimize the incident will be immediately recognized." The lead attendant swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, ma'am. I allowed my frustration to affect my behavior. When you observed the situation earlier, I misinterpreted it as criticism of my service. I reacted inappropriately and struck your arm. There is no excuse for that, and I fully acknowledge it was wrong." The woman nodded slightly. "Acknowledgement is the first step. Now I need to know why this happened. What factors contributed to such a lapse in judgment?" Another attendant spoke up, her voice quiet and careful. "There were misunderstandings and assumptions," she said. We did not consider that our passenger might be someone with authority beyond the usual expectations. We assumed behavior, and our assumptions influenced our actions." The woman listened intently, her eyes steady. "Assumptions can be dangerous," she said softly. "They lead to errors in judgment, they affect relationships, and they can create unnecessary tension. Awareness and attention to detail are critical, especially when dealing with people in any capacity. This includes respect for every individual's dignity, regardless of appearances or assumptions." The lead attendant looked down at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "Ma'am, I understand. I see now that our assumptions and lack of professionalism created the situation, and I deeply regret my actions. I am willing to take responsibility, whatever steps are necessary to make amends." The woman's gaze was calm but firm. "Responsibility must be followed by action," she said. "Acknowledgement alone is not enough. You must demonstrate your commitment to professionalism through clear, corrective measures. That includes accountability to your colleagues, proper reporting of the incident, and a commitment to ensuring it never happens again." She paused briefly, letting her words settle. "Furthermore, it is essential to reflect on how personal biases and impatience can influence behavior. Awareness of these factors is crucial for anyone in a position of service or leadership. You must learn from this experience, not merely regret it." The attendants nodded, absorbing each word. There was no room for argument or distraction. The woman's demeanor created a natural focus, a shared understanding that her perspective was rooted in fairness and clarity, but also in absolute authority. They realized that this was not just a conversation, it was a turning point, a lesson in responsibility and professionalism. "Ma'am," the lead attendant said quietly, "I will submit a full report detailing the incident. I will also participate in any follow-up measures you require. I want to correct my behavior and ensure the standards of this flight and future flights are maintained." The woman inclined her head slightly. "That is appropriate. Transparency and accountability are crucial. Once the report is completed, I will review it personally, Any necessary corrective actions will be taken, and I expect full cooperation from all staff involved. This includes reflection, training, and ensuring that respect and professionalism are consistently upheld. She paused, her eyes scanning the attendants. You must understand that actions have consequences, but learning and growth are equally important. Mistakes are part of being human, but how you respond to them defines your character and competence. This incident can serve as a moment of growth if it is approached with humility, reflection, and commitment to change. The lead attendant nodded again, a deep sense of understanding reflected in their eyes. Yes, ma'am, we will comply fully. I see the seriousness of the situation and the opportunity for growth it presents. The woman's calm authority did not waver. Good. I expect no further lapses in behavior. Every passenger, every colleague, and every action must be approached with professionalism, patience, and respect. This is the standard. It is not negotiable. The attendants remained silent for a moment, absorbing the clarity and weight of her words. The cabin had returned to a quieter rhythm, but the air carried a subtle tension, an awareness of the change that had occurred. The woman's calm, measured authority had shifted the dynamics entirely. The incident was no longer just a mistake. It had become a lesson, a demonstration of how patience, observation, and dignity could command respect far more effectively than anger or confrontation. Passengers around the cabin had begun to notice the quiet interaction, though they could not hear every word. There was a sense of curiosity, admiration, and perhaps even awe. The woman, previously just another traveler among many, was now recognized as someone remarkable, whose composure and intelligence had brought order and clarity to an otherwise tense situation. The woman leaned back slightly in her seat, taking a deep breath. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, thinking not about retribution but about the lesson that could be imparted. She understood that the attendants were human. They could make mistakes, but it was the response to those mistakes that truly mattered. Professionalism, accountability, and respect were non-negotiable, and she intended to ensure those standards were understood and upheld. The lead attendant finally spoke again, voice steady but filled with humility. Ma'am, I understand the importance of what you are saying. I will act accordingly and ensure that all corrective measures are followed. I am grateful for the guidance, and I will take this as an opportunity to improve my service and professionalism. The woman nodded, her expression calm but resolute. That is all I ask. Respect, professionalism, and accountability are the foundations of every action you take. Learn from this incident and let it guide your behavior in the future. Mistakes may occur, but the choice to grow and act responsibly is always yours. The attendants bowed their heads slightly, silently acknowledging her authority and the seriousness of the situation. The woman allowed the conversation to conclude naturally, her presence alone commanding a sense of discipline and focus that left a lasting impression. As the plane continued its flight, the cabin settled into a renewed rhythm. Passengers returned to their activities, some glancing occasionally at the woman, quietly impressed by the poise and strength she had displayed. The flight attendants moved with careful attention, their actions deliberate and measured, aware now that respect and professionalism were paramount. The woman's calm composure remained unchanged. She allowed herself a small internal smile, not one of triumph but of satisfaction that clarity and accountability had been established. The incident had been resolved with dignity and fairness, and the lesson had been conveyed without unnecessary drama or anger. Outside the windows, the sun began its slow descent, casting warm golden hues across the clouds. Inside the cabin, a sense of quiet order had returned, though the impact of the confrontation lingered subtly in the air. The woman sat quietly, her hands resting lightly on her lap, observing the renewed focus and professionalism of the staff. She knew that the remainder of the flight would proceed smoothly, guided by the clarity and standards she had established. And so the plane continued its journey, carrying not just passengers and crew, but also a powerful lesson in respect, accountability, and human dignity. The woman remained the steady center of authority, calm and composed, demonstrating through her actions and words that leadership, patience, and fairness could resolve even the most tense and challenging situations. The stage was now set for the final part of the journey, where reflection, resolution, and the lasting impact of her actions would become fully evident. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, when the plane began its approach toward the destination. Inside the cabin, a sense of calm had returned. The previous tension, which had gripped the passengers and crew alike, had gradually shifted into quiet reflection. The woman remained seated, composed and observant, yet she carried a subtle satisfaction. The incident that had begun the flight with unease had now been transformed into an opportunity for learning and clarity. Passengers whispered softly among themselves, exchanging impressions of what they had witnessed. Some marveled at the woman's calm and composure, while others were struck by the way she had addressed the attendants without anger, yet with undeniable authority. The story of the earlier confrontation had spread quietly through the cabin, and though everyone had kept their manners, there was an unmistakable sense of awe in the air. The lead flight attendant moved through the cabin with a careful attentiveness, ensuring that all passengers were comfortable and well cared for. Their demeanor was different now, no longer colored by arrogance or impatience, but guided by a quiet professionalism. Each gesture, each word reflected the lesson that had been imparted. They approached their work with mindfulness, conscious of the expectations set by the woman and the standards she had reinforced. The woman observed this transformation with a quiet nod of approval. She did not need to intervene further. Her presence alone had communicated the expectations clearly, yet she allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey, on the events that had unfolded, and on the deeper lessons that extended far beyond the confines of this flight. Mistakes, she understood, were inevitable. What mattered was the response, how individuals chose to act when confronted with truth, accountability, and the need to correct their behavior. She glanced out of the window, watching the clouds drift below like a soft, endless sea. In the midst of this serene landscape, she thought about the ripple effects of calm authority. People often assumed that respect must be demanded through loud voices, force, or dominance, yet what she had demonstrated was the opposite. True influence came through composure, observation, and measured action. She had allowed the attendants the space to recognize their own errors, to reflect on their behavior, and to take responsibility without unnecessary humiliation or confrontation. The junior attendants, who had initially been nervous and uncertain, were now moving through the cabin with careful confidence. Their attention to detail was evident, and their interactions with passengers carried a new layer of professionalism. Some exchanged brief, encouraging glances with the lead attendant, a silent acknowledgement that they had all learned something profound. The woman had not scolded them. She had guided them, and the lesson was far more enduring because it had been delivered with respect and clarity. A few passengers, curious and respectful, approached the woman gently, expressing their admiration for how she had handled the situation. She received their comments with quiet gratitude, her responses measured and kind. There was no boastfulness, no display of superiority, only a calm acknowledgement that responsibility, when handled thoughtfully, could inspire understanding and positive change. The cabin, once charged with tension and uncertainty, now carried a sense of reflection and quiet appreciation. The plane began its descent, and the crew prepared for landing with precision. Each task was performed with heightened awareness, a clear focus on safety, professionalism, and respect for everyone on board. The lead attendant coordinated with the junior staff efficiently, offering guidance where needed and ensuring that all procedures were followed to the highest standard. The woman observed this, noting the visible difference between the actions of the crew before and after the incident. The transformation was subtle yet unmistakable, a testament to the effectiveness of calm authority paired with fairness. As the runway came into view, the woman allowed herself a brief moment to consider the broader lessons of the day. Leadership, she reflected, was not about asserting power through force or intimidation. It was about guiding, observing, and enabling people to recognize their own errors and make meaningful changes. The attendants had made a mistake, but the way she had approached the situation had turned that mistake into an opportunity for growth. It was a reminder that patience and understanding often yielded far greater results than anger or impulsive reactions. Passengers settled into their seats, anticipating the landing, yet the earlier incident lingered in their thoughts. Conversations were quieter now, tinged with reflection rather than idle chatter. Many had witnessed something remarkable, not just a conflict resolved, but a lesson in human behavior, accountability, and dignity. The woman's calm, steady approach had left an impression that would remain long after the flight was over. The plane touched down smoothly, the landing controlled and precise. Applause broke out from a few passengers, not only in appreciation for the skilled pilots but also for the overall sense of calm and professionalism that had returned to the cabin. The woman rose gracefully from her seat, gathering her belongings with quiet efficiency. She moved through the aisle with the same composed presence that had characterized the entire flight. The lead attendant approached her once more, their posture respectful and attentive. "Ma'am, on behalf of all the crew, I want to thank you for your guidance today. Your approach and clarity have helped us all understand the importance of professionalism and respect. I cannot overstate how much we have learned from this." The woman nodded gently, her voice calm and even. "Thank you. Remember that accountability is not about punishment alone, but about ensuring growth and understanding. Mistakes are part of life, but how you respond to them defines your character and the experience you create for others. Carry this lesson forward in all your interactions." The attendants acknowledged her words with sincerity, their expressions reflecting the depth of their understanding. There was no forced display of gratitude. It was genuine, grounded in the realization that they had been guided rather than scolded. The woman's quiet authority had left an indelible mark on their professionalism and perspective. Passengers began to disembark, some offering polite nods or smiles as they passed the woman. She returned these gestures with quiet grace, her focus still centered on her own schedule and plans. Yet there was a sense of connection, a recognition that her calm and composed handling of the incident had left a positive influence not only on the crew, but also on those observing from nearby seats. Outside the plane, the warm light of the setting sun illuminated the runway, casting long shadows and soft reflections across the tarmac. The woman moved toward her car with quiet purpose, the rhythmic steps of the crew behind her marking the completion of the flight's chapter. She did not linger in reflection for long. She was accustomed to moving forward, focused on the next stage of her day, yet she carried the satisfaction of knowing that a meaningful impact had been made. The lead attendant and their team returned to the cabin briefly, to finalize reports and discuss steps for follow-up. Their conversation was serious but constructive, focusing on how to implement the lessons learned from the incident. The woman's influence extended beyond the physical presence she